have been assigned a paper topic in which you will be addressing stylistic difference as it relates to a common theme. Now, despite whatever theme you have chosen that I have assigned, or if you've picked your own theme and gotten prior approval, you're not going rogue, keep in mind that there is some flexibility in how you can interpret this theme. So for this tutorial where I discuss how I would go about writing this paper, surprise, surprise, I am choosing the theme of women misbehaving. Now for the two works that I have selected, I am interpreting women misbehaving as women who are subverting social conventions by expressing an agency that, for each time period, tends to bristle against the social mainstream regarding what is appropriate conduct for a woman. So the paper requirements also stipulate that I analyze two works of art that date to different time periods, and that both of these works of art need to date to after the Baroque period. But in this instance, and only in this instance, I am the professor and I can do what I want. So one of my pieces is going to date to the Middle Ages, which technically is outside of the date range of this class. Now, of course, there's an agenda here. This allows me to slip in the total boss, Hildegard of Bingen, who I typically do not get to cover in class. And this is an artist every single person should know about, so this is definitely my humanitarian service for the day. The other artist that I'm going to address is Tracey Emin, a contemporary artist affiliated with the style known as YBA, or Young British Artists. Although, if I can be completely honest, I am a little more comfortable locating her with the postmodernists because she seems to be on the cusp as this sort of like transitional artist between postmodernism and the contemporary approach. Now let's start out with our earlier work of art, and I'll provide a bit of context here as well as a discussion of subject matter, since both of these are critical and both do inform an overall ideology of a style. Now, because this is not a very long paper, this will have to be sort of limited. This work dates to the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages in general, as we know, was a time of pretty intense religiosity where Christianity had extensive religious and political power and virtually controlled art production for a roughly 1,000-year time period. So it's no surprise then that we have a religious work of art here in the form of an illuminated manuscript, a lovely hand-painted book, which was quite common of an art form during this time period. What we're looking at here on the left-hand side is a page from the Rupertsberg Scivias, which were paintings of Hildegard's which recorded her visions of prophecy. It was said that she had these visions when she would suffer from migraines, and she interpreted them as a voice from heaven, as if God was directly communicating to her. And in this self-portrait that you see over here, this is her depicting her having these visions, these like squid fingers coming down and touching her head, which I just want to say as an aside, to see an artist's self-portrait at this time in the Middle Ages is extremely, extremely rare. So this is yet another example of Hildegard being a complete and total trailblazer. Now I want to get back to this idea of God communicating directly to her. This alone is something to take note of because we've seen this before, especially if you took Art 200, the Survey 1 course with me, this idea of suggesting privilege through direct interaction with a deity. At this time, it would be highly unusual for women to locate themselves in such a regarded position. So we can already see that in a society and a religious institution that favored men, where women really were denied active participation, that this would be a woman who would be considered misbehaving. Now let's look over here at this image on the left, this single page that I have for us to concentrate on. The subject matter is the apocalypse, and actually there are few biblical books that have been illustrated more than the apocalypse. Extremely common subject matter. But Hildegard did something that no other artist had yet done. She actually produced an incredibly groundbreaking image here. You are looking at one of the very first known depictions of the Antichrist. Here he is, right here. So scary. Let's take a closer look. Now, we do need to address the visual components of style through various points of formal analysis. In your paper, you are required to address 3 per artwork. Now, this piece is right along with what we typically see in the medieval paintings. Images tend to be rather straightforward, very simple, with flatly rendered figures that are almost cartoon-like in their oversimplification. And these figures tend to be set against these nondescript spatial planes to perhaps suggest the kind of abstract spiritual spaces that were so common in the Byzantine period, which we know the Byzantine period continues to exercise significant influence in the Middle and the later Middle Ages. Also during this time period, there is a heavy emphasis on iconography, which of course I'm loving because iconography is my absolute favorite, and we are definitely seeing some really innovative and provoking iconography in this piece. Now, how do we connect these points to the paper topic? Remember, please remember this, all things need to lead back to the topic, back to this theme. So in this case, how is Hildegard going against the social expectations of her gender at this time? First, let's talk about the iconography. The iconography that Hildegard of Bingen employed was traditional, but the mixture of the symbolism was employed in a daring way that had little precedence. So she basically is making her own rules, establishing her own approach to art making in ways that have never been done before. She is outright rejecting the status quo, which translates to demonstrating an independence that was generally not permitted to women at this time. Now, unfortunately, and this is the tragedy of my life, this paper is too short to do a full-on iconographical analysis. The struggle obviously is real, so I'll just give you an example. So we see here this crouching woman, and she has been identified as Ecclesia. And Hildegard's depiction of Ecclesia is both traditional and innovative at the same time. Ecclesia is an allegorical figure of the church, and we can identify her here through the typical iconographical symbol of the crown. But Hildegard departs from this and shows an interesting image of a woman with a demon face at the crotch. The interpretation of this is interesting, and it is a matter of debate amongst scholars, but it has been suggested that it is showing the birth of the Antichrist, an experience so violent it could be seen as reverse rape, which is reinforced with the blood on the thighs, which we see here as well as here. The visual rhetoric of rape, while intense, is not completely out in left field. Hildegard is believed to be using this imagery to warn that a corrupted church, a robbing of the purity, so to speak, would bring about the end of days. She had reformist beliefs, but due to her gender, she had to express these criticisms discreetly, the type of veiled images that you see here. So how can we connect the other compositional features I identified to the theme? The straightforward presentation, typical of medieval illuminated manuscript painting, communicates this message clearly and efficiently, despite the almost subliminal messaging of her iconography, in which she is using her work to speak out against a powerful institution run by men. Now, let's move on to our second misbehaving woman, Tracey Emin, again associated with the YBA, Young British Artists, who are a group of loosely associated contemporary, or some people say postmodern artists, who began making artwork in the late 1980s. They are linked primarily through place, working in London, and through similar artistic strategy. Shocking content communicated through an experimental use of found objects, with the intent to aggressively break down the barriers between high and low culture. My Bed is an installation populated with banal objects that have controversial meaning. So without even knowing anything yet about this piece, we can already see that it is right in line with the typical facets of this style. In terms of postmodern and contemporary art in general, we are seeing an experimental use of material, which is typical for the time period, and a continued attempt to disrupt the boundaries between viewer and artwork, between art and life. I like to compare Hildegard and Emin because they're essentially doing the same thing, where here Emin employs a straightforward iconographical language, yet it is still at the same time one without precedence. The other thing about Emin's work is that it's innovative in terms of it being a self-portrait, where she communicates her sense of self not through an anthropomorphic image of herself, but through a collection of found objects, objects we would typically consider to be trash, no less. Here, she is transforming these everyday objects into symbols to disrupt the boundaries between the often lofty elitism of art and the stark reality of life challenges. And in doing so, she is boldly rejecting the stereotype of a proper, delicate femininity that is distinct from the vulgarity of promiscuity and menstruation and alcoholism, mental illness, depression, and abortion. The objects in my bed include a mattress and a bed frame, pillows, dirty bed sheets, dirty stockings, a towel, empty vodka bottles, slippers, underwear stained with menstrual blood, a used tampon, apple cores, cigarette butts, birth control pills, morning after pills, a used condom, Polaroid portraits, and a stuffed toy. And that's just a sampling. You can look closely and you can see other objects as well. Now, this list does also vary amongst sources, and this might be due to the fact that the piece was damaged and had to be remade. Also, some of the objects, such as the used condom, have disintegrated over time. Let's take another look at the view here. Now, we need 2 more points of formal analysis to complete the requirements of this assignment. And you might notice that I'm including iconography as formal analysis, which obviously those are 2 different methodologies. But I give you permission for this paper to use iconography as a formal point. So you can just keep that in mind. So anyways, 2 more points of formal analysis are required. So we've already discussed the actual space that's being used by the fact that she is creating this installation. And we can talk about some more things. We can talk about the haphazard presentation of the objects. And we can also talk about the sheer number of them. So there's our 3 points. Actual space, this sort of haphazard presentation, and then this idea maybe of perhaps of like repetition, the sheer number of objects being used. What makes this work so effective and so controversial is we have a material record of a woman who is definitely misbehaving. Now first, let's think about a bed in general. Let's do a little iconographical analysis because I just can't help myself. A bed is considered an especially personal space because of its associations with some of the more intimate aspects of life. Sleep, dreaming, illness, sex. But here Emin displays her bed publicly in an institutional setting, in a museum. And herein lies the rawness of the work, the honesty of its intimacy, which is something that definitely tends to provoke discomfort when someone is so overtly open about pain. This bed was the site of emotional despondency and self-destructive behavior that was brought about by a failed romantic relationship and a subsequent abortion. The objects that you see in this piece were actual objects next to her bed. These are not recreations. These are not artistic invention. So here Emin is literally and figuratively airing her dirty laundry. And without the boundary between art and life has become a little too fine to be comfortable. One more view. If we consider the reaction to this piece, it provides further insight into how Emin is presenting a picture of femininity that goes against cultural stereotypes. First, the piece was dismissed as gratuitously shocking in a way that pushes the limits of decency. And that was a quote from a critic. So we see, first of all, that her honest expressions of emotional pain are being dismissed. And also that this vital aspect of her personhood is being marginalized. Second, the artwork has been vandalized twice while it has been on display at the Tate Modern in London. 2 Chinese men jumped on the piece, deciding that the bed called for an impromptu pillow fight, which is reflecting in my mind an appalling sense of entitlement and ownership to this piece, in which their actions were a violent and invasive dismissal of Emin's emotional pain and lived experience. In another instance, a female gallery patron attempted to tidy up the installation, clean up her bedroom, and thereby imposing a normative femininity that is defined by domestic labor. So, this theme comes from expectations placed upon women to conform to culturally prescribed standards and codes of behavior, which creates a problematic conflict between projected assumed experience and the actual lived one. Put simply, Hildegard of Bingen was an absolutely remarkable figure, regardless of her gender. But she did live in a time that is characterized by limited intellectual opportunity for women, yet she was able to be powerful and highly influential. This one person, Hildegard of Bingen, was an abbess, a religious thinker, a prophet, a reformer, a composer, a poet, a dramatist, a medical writer, oh, and by the way, also one of the most groundbreaking contemporary artists of her time. Tracey Emin rejects the marginalization of female agency by unapologetically placing front and center the more messy life events of women that are ignored, or worse, altogether erased from cultural representation. In both cases, the adoption of this new iconography on the part of both artists is significant. According to Joan Semmel and April Kingsley, it is this tactic that has allowed women artists to make progress in the representation of female agency. But the final part of this paper does ask for valuation. Which piece do I find more effective from a stylistic perspective? It's a hard question because both of these are incredibly significant works of art. But if I had to choose, I would say that it is Hildegard's that's the more effective representation of this theme in terms of context. And I would say that Emin's work is more effective in terms of formal quality. In the end, I will have to identify Hildegard's work as just slightly more indicative of a woman misbehaving, for she truly departed from the social expectations of her gender during the time in which she lived, far beyond what Emin was doing. She transcended these boundaries artistically, professionally, religiously, to exercise a wider influence beyond the visual arts. She engaged in what is called patriarchal bargaining, where she communicates a sense of power, but does so by taking a sort of stab at the social confines established by a patriarchal system. Her sense of power is, I would say, subliminal, maybe? Discreet might be a better word, so that she does not establish the order of things, the way that things should be. And she did this by working within established traditions of medieval painting, but subtly manipulating them to give herself a voice, to critique a powerful religious institution while suggesting a privileged relationship with God. Now, one more thing before we part ways. Please do not forget that this is a research paper, so you will need to have a minimum of 3 outside text-based sources, not including your textbook. And be sure that you are mindful of your formatting. Please correct all errors so that you do not lose points. And with that, I wish you good luck with your research paper.